The Mexican Council on Foreign Relations presents Coyuntura Comexi. In today's episode, Elections and Democracy in India, a conversation with Dr. Sanjay Ruparelia, Associate Professor of Politics and Jarislowsky Democracy Chair at Toronto Metropolitan University. What is your outlook for India's foreign policy in this third Modi mandate? Will it be more protagonist, India pushing its global agenda, or will the reality of the elections result make for a more inward-looking government?
I think there's going to be broad continuity in Indian foreign policy. The term that's often used to describe its foreign policy approach is a desire to maintain its strategic autonomy. After independence, when Jawaharlal Nehru was prime minister, there was a doctrine of non-alignment during the Cold War. And a desire not to be a subordinate ally of either the United States or the USSR. And in the post-Cold War era, it's a doctrine of strategic autonomy. So India works with many states. For instance, it imports arms, as we know, in this terrible war in Ukraine after the Russian invasion. It maintains very strong relations with Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union. It's extremely reliant on arms imports from Russia, but it also imports arms from Israel and France and the United States, and the latter three are sort of increasingly important, but Russia still remains the dominant supplier. It has important diplomatic relations with Russia in the UN and many other fora, as well as Iran, states that the West, is very much in conflict with today. So India has often seen itself as as what's called a bridging power between East and West and North and South. It's now been described, particularly under Mr. Modi, as a desire to becoming a leading power, to sort of set the terms in many different policy domains. Whether it can do that, remains to be seen. It's a function of its power, which is partly military and partly economic, and not least its soft power. And I think this is where the backsliding we've seen in India over the last decade, certainly weakened its soft power. This is sort of the attractiveness of its model to other countries in the world, I think. But for reasons of realpolitik, as we know, China was seen as the main strategic competitor and even threat and rival to the United States and many Western states over the last decade. We've seen rising conflict between the West and China on a number of issues. India and China had their first violent border conflict just in the last few years. We've not seen any violence of that kind since the 1970s. So India-China's relations are at their sort of most difficult and contentious and fragile that we've seen for decades. At the same time, India, like many countries in the world, not least the United States, its trade with China has grown despite these conflicts. And so it's extremely interwoven economically with China at its own disadvantage. The terms of trade favor China versus India. So what will Indian foreign policy do? I think it is very concerned about, what it perceives as a rising threat from China. The border issue is still unresolved. Chinese troops effectively changed the de facto border that divides the two countries. It's a disputed border that runs almost 3,000 kilometers. And that status quo ante hasn't been, we haven't had a return to the status quo ante, right? And so India faces that, so it's concerned about its relations with China and the risk of a military conflict. It's deepened its ties with the United States, but as we've seen, there's been some very explosive allegations that Indian officials were involved, and this is still running its way through the courts in Canada and the United States. We're targeting Khalistani separatists on U.S. and Canadian soil. Led to the killing of a Khalistani advocate in Canada a year ago, as many of your listeners would know. So diplomatic relations have become very fraught in some ways, but the broad strategic approach of the United States is to deepen its commitment and deepen its relationship with India in terms of defense, critical and emerging technologies, trade opportunities, and so on. There's a strategic bet on India being the partner of the United States, not a subordinate ally like Japan or what South Korea might become, but basically the power that it has to support in its competition and conflict with China into the 21st century. So I think those are the broad continuities. This government, I think, in many ways, I think there's a general continuity across governments in India, but what this government has been doing, which has raised eyebrows and certainly have maybe crossed some certain red lines, as I was mentioning, with the idea that they may be carrying out transnational repression against perceived opponents of the regime, that, you know, it's far more assertive and, you might say, in some cases even just reckless in pursuing its national interest. So I think what we're going to see in this government, what's very striking, there's a government that's now been installed. The BJP is still the dominant power. It has 240 seats of the 272 that are needed. All the key positions in cabinet have still gone back to BJP prime ministers and to the incumbents who held them before. So Mr. Jaishankar as foreign minister, Mr. Amit Shah as the home minister, the finance minister is the same, the defense minister is the same, and they all belong to the BJP. So I think we're going to see more continuity. We're going to see India continue to grow as an economy. It's slated to be the third largest economy by 2030. It's going to increasingly press its demands for recognition and status and influence in many different policy domains and multilateral organizations. And so I think, you know, I don't think we're going to see too much shift in that. But you are right in saying that it's a coalition government and it relies on allies staying with the BJP in order to stay in power. So it's more vulnerable theoretically. And if there are domestic disputes where these allies, particularly those two or three parties that hold the balance of power in the new government, if they feel that their interests are better served by leaving the government and toppling it in parliament, then that could well take place. And so the government will have to pay more attention to managing the coalition, to domestic political issues, and to potential conflicts, to make sure that they don't undermine its tenure in the next 5 years. So it doesn't have the same. It doesn't have the same autonomy that it did before when it was a majority in parliament on its own.
What do you think Indian politics will look like in the next couple of years?
So I think it's a critical moment for Indian democracy. This election was pivotal in the sense that it created a space and an opportunity for the opposition parties, for civil society, for the institutions of state that have been under a lot of pressure, from the judiciary to the election commission to other organs of state, to reassert their autonomy, which is constitutionally mandated, right? So this power that they have lost, the power that has flown to the executive, that there's a rebalancing that has to take place between state and society and between the executive and the judiciary and the legislature. And I think that's a very important moment. So we have to really watch and see what opposition parties do in parliament, what they do in civil society more broadly, what do civic organizations do? Can the media reclaim more of its integrity? Because it really sort of fell under the sway of the ruling party. It was, not critical, not investigating, not holding the government to account as it should have. So this is a moment to reset domestically. At the same time that the ruling party, and particularly those who are hardline members of the larger Hindu nationalist movement, they remain completely committed to their ideology of creating a Hindu nation. So we're going to see a lot of contests, and we're going to see tensions, and we may well see conflicts domestically, and we'll have to see how those play out. So it was an unexpected surprise defeat in some ways for the BJP, that it lost its majority, but it's still the dominant party. And so these next 5 years will be very critical to revitalize Indian democracy. And I think internationally, as I mentioned, the trajectory of India is upwards in terms of its economy, although there are real issues, as we were just talking about unemployment and inflation. Inflation is a sort of more sensory matter, but unemployment and providing good jobs for millions of youth that are entering the workforce is a real challenge. Continuing to expand its public infrastructure. In dealing with climate change, India is very much at risk, like many developing countries, from the worst effects of climate change, of which they contributed the least, unlike the West. So, these are the sort of challenges it faces, and that spills over into the international. I think we'll continue to see India growing in power, I think military and economically, we've seen sort of there'll be growing attention and investment in its defense production and capabilities, a desire to expand manufacturing as the West tries to de-risk its linkages with China and diversify its supply chains. So I think India will continue to benefit with that if it can seize those opportunities. And I think that a more democratic India, um, one that is trying to course correct, will be actually in a much better position to take advantage of those opportunities and openings um, than what we've seen in the last decade.